Hi, my name is Rita Amorichinda, and I welcome you to IP series where we talk about recent IP cases and development globally. If this is your first time joining us, please don't forget to favorite my podcast on Anchor so you don't miss out on any episode. So, on today's Christmas IP series edition, we'll be talking brands, fashion brands like Gucci, Chanel, D&G, Tubo, all your favorite fashion brands, and it's really going to be an interesting one. Our guest for today is a published author and an authority in the fashion world. So let's meet our guest for today. I hope you also have a good time like I am going to. So, welcome to IP series, Rosie. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Rosie Burbridge, an intellectual property lawyer and a partner at a London-based law firm called Gunnar Cook. And yeah, I've been working in intellectual property law and more specifically for fashion clients for, I guess, about 12 years now. Time flies, particularly in 2020. But my big claim to fame is my book called European Fashion Law, A Practical Guide from Startup to Global Success, which came out in February 2019. So I think that might be why I've been invited to join you guys.
Yeah. So, what is fashion law? Since that is like your core area of practice, what is fashion law in your own?
So, I mean, obviously, there isn't a specific set of law that only applies to fashion, but there are laws that are more relevant for the fashion industry. So, for example, in the world of intellectual property, designs are much more important for fashion than patents. That's not to say that patents are never relevant, but they tend to be much more important for industries like pharmaceuticals. And similarly, things like franchising and distribution agreements are, and agency agreements are much more important for the fashion industry than potentially some others. And obviously, things have got a lot more complicated over the last year, particularly for businesses who have quite a strong property portfolio, because with so many shops being shut, that has had lots of interesting implications. So I suppose that's a slightly long-winded way of saying that fashion law is a combination of the different legal principles that are most relevant for the fashion industry.
So you did mention fashion and change. What do you think is the impact of COVID-19 on the fashion industry, given the fact that every industry was affected by the lockdown and also the pandemic?
I mean, I would say fashion has been particularly badly affected. That's partly because it has quite an international supply chain. So even when the shops could still be open, it was quite difficult for a lot of businesses to fulfill orders. For example, if they manufactured in China, then obviously the Chinese lockdowns at the start of the year meant that it was difficult to get those fashion items distributed. And then that problem has continued as time has gone on. There have also been problems with fulfillment warehouses, for e-commerce businesses where the quite strict measures have had to be implemented to stop the spread of COVID-19 around those kind of environments. And then, that's just at the sort of getting the goods to the consumer side of things. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, some shops have been shut. The big problem has been on the demand side, and that's been not terribly consistent. It depends quite a lot on the type of fashion business. So, for example, athleisure and more casual wear that's sold online has done okay. In some cases, they've been able to grow. But if a business is more focused on formal wear, nobody's going to parties at the moment, or if they are, they definitely shouldn't be. So that that side of the fashion industry has really suffered because there just isn't the same demand that there would normally be. And obviously, things like weddings. I don't know how it is around the world, but in the UK, the maximum number of people who can attend a wedding is 15. So obviously,
What's the fusion of tech in the fashion industry?
well, so technology is sort of when I was training many years ago, there was a lot of talk about the convergence of technology and media, and nobody really even thinks of that anymore. You know, technology and media are pretty much synonymous. There's no huge differentiation there. And I think the same is happening in other industries, including ones where there's a tangible product like fashion. So obviously technology is helping in terms of the distribution process around e-commerce and that side of things. And then it's also making a big difference in terms of the sales side. So obviously social media is becoming much more important as a means of advertising and marketing products, with a lot more things being purchased directly via Instagram, for example. Um, and then there's been a lot more innovation in terms of the production side. So clever fabrics, both in terms of like adding in smart technology into the actual fabric itself and looking from a sustainability perspective at the recycling of fabric and using recycled materials, particularly things like ocean plastic and that sort of thing. So there's been some really fascinating changes that have happened over the last couple of years, and I think that will continue. One trend that I'm really excited about is blockchain and using
Yeah.
blockchain to be able to track products around the world and for it to identify a particular product. And I think that will have some quite important implications for things like counterfeit goods and for just generally being able to understand the exact supply chain and hopefully prompt slightly different consumer decisions to be made as a result of that.
The relationship between e-commerce and the fashion industry. I know you just talked about that in the previous question.
So, I mean, obviously, a lot of fashion products are sold via e-commerce now, and that has exacerbated significantly over the last year when so many physical stores have been shut. And I guess the important thing, like the connection maybe, is that fashion is possibly more at the driving end of e-commerce now. I think a lot of e-commerce started off being more focused on things like books or CDs where people knew what they were buying, like it was a known product. And now people are much more comfortable about buying something where they don't know what the material is going to feel like or whether the color will match the image. But people are sort of more used to purchasing online, trying it, and then maybe returning it or maybe keeping it. Um, yeah.
Like your best fashion case for 2020 or 2019, 2020.
So I think both the best and probably the, well, maybe not controversial, but most sort of significant in the UK at least, came quite early on. And it was so just taking a step back, it's quite difficult to protect three-dimensional objects like clothing in the UK under copyright law, or it was until this case came out, which is called Response Against Edinburgh Woolen Mill. And essentially, this applied a case that came out, I think, in Portugal a few years ago, and it went up to the European Court of Justice, and it was possibly one of the last cases in the UK to consider European Court of Justice precedent. But that's not why it's important. It concerned a jacquard fabric, so that's a fabric which is not completely flat. Uh, it's where you've got a kind of raised, bumpy element, and what had been copied was the sort of bumps, and it's difficult to protect that because our copyright law protects graphical representations, but this was three-dimensional, even though it was relatively um, relatively flat. It wasn't completely flat, and essentially the court found that it could be protected by copyright. So even though it was not a completely flat surface, that it was possible for copyright protection to apply. I mean, this is a real paraphrasing of the judgment, but I don't want to, it's not so interesting to go into the details. And essentially, this is quite an important change because where you had something that was more than 3 years old or which wasn't first made available in the European Economic Area or designed by someone who was from the EU or from one of various other countries, so like Hong Kong, New Zealand, and some Caribbean countries, where there was a reciprocal agreement, unless you kind of fell within one of the qualifying criteria for a design, it wasn't possible to protect a lot of three-dimensional clothing and bags and accessories and all that sort of thing as well. So it's it's not necessarily the most well known or the most exciting, but in terms of importance, certainly in the UK, that was probably the number one case. Um,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Okay, so what are the trends you think we should be looking out for in 2021 with regards to the fashion industry?
Well, I mean, obviously, nobody necessarily looks at the way that I dress and thinks that I'm a trendsetter, but um, I, I think the obviously some bricks and mortar stores, well, fingers crossed, the vaccine looks like it's going to be rolled out, and I suspect that it will be possible to go back to stores before too long. And I think a trend that we were starting to see before COVID will sort of really take off, which is stores as much more of an experience. So having a mixture of cafes and co-working spaces and selling much more concessions and pop-ups within larger stores. um, I suspect that that will be a big trend that will continue because they'll be wanting to entice people back into physical locations, and I think people will want that as well, having been sort of cooped up at home for a long time. So that I suspect will
Yeah.
be one trend. And then I don't know, it's really hard to say with fashion. Some people are predicting that we're going to be in athleisure forever. But I mean, if normally in fashion we go from one extreme to another, so it wouldn't surprise me if suddenly everybody goes back to wearing like really fancy suits and clothing, just because that hasn't been a possibility for ages. I'm not like, it doesn't seem like a logical change, but that's just the way the fashion industry is, right? It's not necessarily about logic. And I
Yeah.
think generally fun is something that we have lacked. So, I mean, it wouldn't
True.
surprise me if we get some really bold colors and, you know, exciting new designs coming out of the back of all of this. And then obviously, as I touched on earlier, like sustainability is going to become much more important, and having a lot more transparency around supply chains and that side of things.
So what would you say is the best form of IP to protect fashion designers from counterfeiting and their goods being imitated out there?
So, I mean, there's two that are important in different ways. I think trademarks are amazing and underappreciated rights. Obviously, I think most people are aware that you can get a trademark that covers a word and potentially a logo, but a lot of people don't necessarily know that you can protect, in some circumstances, a color or the shape of a product. Those tend to only be available for really well-known products, but it's still that is a really valuable way of having a measure of exclusivity over a different brand. Then the sort of what happens quite a lot, maybe not so much with counterfeits, but with other types of copies, is that the thing that's taken isn't the name of the product or the name of the brand, but the look of it. So, for example, you might copy the Louis Vuitton fabric, but not any of the trademarks. So, if that happens, then designs in the shape of the product or in the particular pattern can be really valuable. And that, I think, a combination of a good trademark portfolio together with designs is really important. And I mean, one of the things that I notice across my practice is how little designs are understood. And that's because they're technically quite complicated. But in Europe, we have a much stronger designs regime than in most countries around the world because we offer both registered design and unregistered designs. And although the UK is diverging, that approach will continue after the end of the year when we officially leave the EU. So I think, yeah, I would say probably the most important for the fashion industry specifically is designs, but the sort of the key right to always have it is a trademark.
So what are the issues that you think fashion designers face?
I mean, it's a long list, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's all of the things around copying. There's all of the worrying about supply chains. There are big problems around returns of goods and making sure that, any offering is compliant with local law. So that concerns the sort of the basic terms and conditions around supply of goods, but it also concerns things like uh, GDPR, so data protection and that side of things, like keeping customer data secure, making sure that, particularly if you're taking payment and storing payment details, that you're compliant with the different regulations around that. There's just lots and lots of things for fashion designers to worry about. So it's, I think the really important thing is to work with people who have a bit more experience and when you're growing to sort of not just try and do too many things. Like if you're a designer, then it's better to team up with someone who's good on the business side of things rather than trying to do everything yourself.
In your opinion, what is the importance of contract and documentation in the fashion industry?
I mean, obviously, having good contractual protection is important for every business. I think fashion and creative industries generally are less good at getting contracts in place. I think that's partly because creative, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. And if you're a creative personality, then you probably would rather spend your time creating a new design than checking the contracts. The contractual situation is all sorted out and all the admin is under control. um,
True.
so, I mean, the kind of common problems are around agents being appointed and then maybe a distributor registering a trademark thinking that they're doing you a favor, but then they have a trademark for your brand in a country, and that can create quite a big problem if you fall out with a distributor in the future. Um, or and you don't own your rights necessarily around the world, and it can be quite time consuming and expensive to get that right back. So it's always important to make sure that you're protected contractually there, but also, ideally to file the trademark first so that they just don't have that opportunity. Those are the kind of things that I see quite commonly, and obviously around sort of more confidential information, like potentially the supply chain and pricing that's being paid for goods and that sort of thing as well.
Okay, so in wrapping up now, what is or who is your best fashion brand, and what is the best mode of resolving fashion related disputes?
So I think it's what works best for dispute resolution tends to vary a lot on the type of issue and the way in which the parties are negotiating. So sometimes, I mean, obviously, getting a settlement is generally the best route for everyone because you have a quick result and you've got certainty. But you shouldn't settle with someone who's being extremely unreasonable. So if you can't get to a fair solution through negotiation, then going through the courts system is just a necessary process to go through. What's really fun and interesting about fashion is it's so international, so you can be quite strategic around which countries to litigate in, potentially going through the registries, like the trademark registries, rather than necessarily going through the courts. So you might apply to invalidate someone's rights if they're suing you, for example, rather than necessarily um, applying for a declaration of non-infringement. I don't, there's just lots of different options. I don't think that there's a best route. It just really depends on how much money's at stake, how important it is to the business, because sometimes you might have a really important brand where there's, the actual number of infringing goods might not be that substantial, but the damage associated with somebody selling it is quite substantial. Like Burberry, with all of the copies that were common in the early 2000s, is quite a good example of that. Like, not necessarily each counterfeiter made a lot of money, but the overall impression of all of these counterfeit goods on sale was very damaging for the brand. So, yeah, it's like all lawyers, I'm not going to give a simple answer. It just depends a bit on the circumstances and on the the relative financial situation of everyone involved.
So you didn't tell us your best
I mean, that's
fashion
because I don't
brand
really
though.
have one. And also, I work for quite a few fashion brands, so I wouldn't want anyone to feel left out.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rosie. It's been a pleasure having you and
Oh,
also
great.
very
Oh, thank
insightful.
you. It's been really great to join
Um,
you. I really appreciate it.
And so we've come to the end of this episode with Rosie on fashion law. Let me know what you guys think about it. If you learned something new, please let me know. If you're a fashion designer, and please take this episode seriously. Until the next IP series, Christmas edition. Cheers, guys. Bye.